The camera opens to the sound of faint whispers, echoes of history that never quite fade. A crown gleams in the dark, not upon a king's head, but resting alone on a table. The voiceover begins. Power. It is what drives empires, topples dynasties, and shapes the fate of nations. But what if the ones who truly ruled never wore the crown? What if the greatest architects of history were not the kings, queens, or emperors standing before their courts, but the shadows behind them, the minds that whispered in their ears and pulled the strings of destiny? Across centuries, unseen figures have shaped the world without ever claiming the throne. They were the cardinals, chancellors, dowagers, bankers, and diplomats, the uncrowned kings who mastered the art of influence. They built alliances, controlled treasuries, shaped ideologies, and even decided when wars would begin or end. Their faces may not always appear in portraits or coins, but their fingerprints are on every corner of history. From the echoing halls of Versailles to the forbidden corridors of the Qing Palace, from the marble courts of Florence to the bustling banks of New York, these figures redefined what power truly means. They showed that authority is not about the throne you sit on, but the system you control. While monarchs basked in glory, these invisible rulers shaped the laws, designed the armies, and commanded the wealth that kept kingdoms alive or brought them to ruin. This story is not about the glitter of crowns or the sound of trumpets. It is about what happens behind the curtain, where secrets are traded for loyalty, where alliances are sealed with silence, and where history itself is rewritten by those who were never supposed to rule. These are the men and women who understood that influence could achieve more than armies ever could. They ruled through persuasion, manipulation, and vision. They were the invisible architects of empire. As the camera moves through scenes of old maps, letters sealed in wax, and portraits fading with time, the voiceover continues. Their legacies are all around us. The centralized governments that define modern nations, the systems of finance that run the world, the balance of power that still shapes diplomacy, all trace back to their unseen hands. Whether through religion, economy, or politics, they taught the world that power works best when it works quietly. This is not just a journey through history. It is a revelation of how influence operates, even today. Because behind every decision, every empire, every leader, there has always been someone unseen, steering the course. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we uncover the untold stories of the people who ruled without thrones, the masterminds who shaped nations from the shadows. From Cardinal Richelieu to Empress Dowager Cixi, from Otto von Bismarck to J.P. Morgan, we'll explore how these hidden figures controlled empires through intellect, alliances, and manipulation. Stay with us as we reveal how power truly works, not in the light of crowns, but in the quiet depths of influence. Throughout history, the image of power has often been tied to crowns, thrones, and the visible symbols of rule. Monarchs, emperors, and conquerors have been celebrated as the architects of empires, their portraits displayed in palaces, their names carved into monuments. Yet, behind these figures, there has always been another class of power, quieter but equally commanding. These were the men and women who ruled without titles, who shaped the destinies of nations through persuasion, intelligence, and manipulation rather than through armies or royal decrees. Their influence, though rarely written into law, was felt in every decision a ruler made. These unseen architects remind us that the face of authority and the hand that guides it are often not the same. The nature of uncrowned power can be found in every era where a ruler depended on counsel, interpretation, or control of information. True power, in many historical contexts, belonged not to the one who sat on the throne, but to those who stood closest to it. These figures did not need crowns, for their authority came from proximity and intellect. They often determined policy, influenced war and peace, and sometimes outlasted the monarchs they served. The sovereign was the voice, but they were the thought behind it. In medieval Europe, this pattern appeared in the relationships between kings and their chief ministers. Cardinal Richelieu of France is one of the clearest examples of an uncrowned ruler. While King Louis XIII wore the crown, Richelieu controlled the levers of the French state. He weakened the power of the nobility, centralized authority, and strengthened France's position in Europe. His mastery lay not in royal heritage, but in political calculation. Through control of the royal council and the machinery of state, Richelieu guided France toward absolute monarchy, paving the way for the reign of Louis XIV. The king ruled France, but Richelieu ruled the king. In England, similar figures emerged. Thomas Cromwell, serving under Henry VIII, rose from humble beginnings to become the architect of the English Reformation. He engineered the legal and administrative changes that separated England from the authority of the Pope, dissolved monasteries, and redirected their wealth into the hands of the crown. Cromwell's influence extended into every part of English governance, yet he was never a king. His fall was as swift as his rise, showing how dangerous it was to wield such power without royal blood. Nonetheless, his legacy reshaped England more profoundly than many monarchs who followed. The phenomenon of unseen rule was not unique to Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, the Grand Viziers often commanded authority that surpassed that of the Sultan in day-to-day affairs. Figures such as Sokalu Mehmed Pasha served under multiple sultans, guiding imperial policy, overseeing vast territories, and managing the delicate balance of power between military, religious, and bureaucratic institutions. The Sultan was the embodiment of empire, but the Grand Vizier was the executor of its will. The empire's longevity owed much to the stability provided by these administrators, who ensured continuity even when rulers changed. In Ming and Qing China, the imperial court was another stage for invisible power. Eunuchs, scholars, and advisors often shaped imperial policy while remaining in the background. During the Ming dynasty, the eunuch Zheng He commanded immense resources to lead maritime expeditions across the Indian Ocean, spreading Chinese influence as far as Africa. Though he was not emperor, he represented imperial will abroad in ways that changed global history. Later, during the Qing period, Empress Dowager Cixi ruled from behind a curtain for nearly half a century. She controlled appointments, managed foreign relations, and navigated China through crises while nominal emperors served as figureheads. Her reign demonstrated that influence could hide behind ritual and tradition, using perception and control of access to command the empire. The British Empire also produced figures who ruled through persuasion and intellect rather than through formal authority. In the 18th and 19th centuries, advisors, diplomats, and administrators often wielded more real power than the monarchs they served. Lord Palmerston, as Foreign Secretary and later Prime Minister, directed British foreign policy with a boldness that sometimes outpaced royal approval. Queen Victoria's name may have defined the era, but it was the politicians, generals, and civil servants who executed the vision of empire. In India, figures such as Warren Hastings and Lord Dalhousie acted as emperors in all but name, expanding British control and laying the foundations of colonial administration. They carried the authority of the crown, yet they often acted with personal initiative that shaped the destiny of millions. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the idea of uncrowned power found a democratic form. Although the system was built on elected offices and constitutional checks, real influence often resided in those who could persuade rather than those who could decree. Advisors, financiers, and strategists became the invisible architects of policy. During the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, for instance, figures such as Harry Hopkins and Cordell Hull shaped decisions that defined the New Deal and wartime diplomacy. They operated not as monarchs, but as trusted minds whose ideas steered the course of government. Their power was informal but decisive. In ancient times, too, there were those who ruled without thrones. In ancient Egypt, the viziers acted as the pharaoh's right hand, managing the economy, overseeing construction, and administering justice. The pharaoh was divine in image, but the vizier ensured that divinity functioned in practice. In the Persian Empire, the royal secretaries and satraps wielded administrative control that sustained one of history's largest empires. In Greece, the philosopher Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great, shaping the mind that would conquer much of the known world. Though Aristotle never commanded armies, his teachings influenced the course of empire through the ruler he helped form. Even in modern times, power continues to follow these unseen patterns. Advisors, lobbyists, and strategists influence policy behind closed doors, shaping national direction without ever appearing on a ballot or wearing a title. The principles remain the same: control of information, persuasion of decision-makers, and mastery of timing. Technology and media have only made this invisible power more sophisticated. The face of leadership may change, but the hidden networks guiding it persist. The subtle nature of influence often depends on mastery of human perception. An effective power behind the throne understands not only policy, but also psychology. Whispers in the right ear can carry more weight than public speeches. The ability to appear loyal while directing outcomes requires both restraint and skill. History is filled with such figures who combined intelligence, patience, and subtlety to move empires toward their preferred ends. Their victories were rarely celebrated publicly, yet they shaped the world's trajectory. One of the most striking examples of invisible rule was Rasputin in Imperial Russia. A peasant-turned mystic, he gained the trust of Tsarina Alexandra during the final years of the Romanov dynasty. His influence over the royal family, particularly in matters of succession and appointments, became so deep that ministers and generals feared his counsel more than the Tsar's decrees. Although Rasputin's power was rooted in charisma and superstition rather than formal office, it illustrates how perception and belief can elevate an individual into the sphere of decision-making. His eventual assassination reflected not only personal hatred, but also a broader anxiety about unseen forces steering the empire toward collapse. In Renaissance Italy, similar forms of invisible rule flourished through the webs of patronage and diplomacy. The Medici family, particularly figures like Lorenzo de' Medici, controlled Florence through banking wealth and political influence while maintaining the outward structure of republican government. Their strategy was to govern through persuasion, alliances, and control of art and finance. They placed allies in key offices, financed papal elections, and guided European politics without formal sovereignty. Their influence extended into religion and culture, shaping not just politics, but the very fabric of Renaissance civilization. The Medici model of power through patronage became a template for later forms of political control, where money and loyalty replaced hereditary right. The church itself was another domain of unseen power. While popes and bishops held formal authority, their decisions often depended on theologians, secretaries, and diplomats who worked behind the scenes. During the Counter-Reformation, Jesuit advisors became the intellectual architects of Catholic renewal. Their reach extended from royal courts to distant colonies, influencing monarchs and shaping policies that redefined Europe's religious map. Even when they did not hold high office, their counsel determined the strategies of empires. In the Spanish Empire, the royal confessors often guided kings on moral and political matters, blending faith with governance. These religious advisors operated in secrecy, yet their words could decide wars and alliances. The pattern reappears in the courts of Asia, where influence often took quieter forms. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate presented a striking case. The emperor remained a symbolic figure while the shogun wielded real authority. Within that structure, however, advisors and senior counselors, such as the Roju, played critical roles in maintaining balance among powerful clans. The emperor's divine status masked a complex hierarchy of decision-makers who ensured that stability endured for centuries. In many ways, this separation between symbol and substance became one of Japan's political strengths, allowing it to maintain order even when individual rulers were weak. In the Mughal Empire, figures like Abu al-Fazl, advisor to Emperor Akbar, shaped imperial ideology and policy through scholarship and insight. Abu al-Fazl's writings, particularly the Ain-i-Akbari, helped define the philosophical foundation of Akbar's reign, emphasizing tolerance and centralization. His intellect provided the blueprint for an empire that balanced diversity and unity. Similarly, in the Delhi Sultanate and other Islamic courts, viziers and scholars often guided rulers who lacked administrative experience. They were the brains behind the sword, translating divine authority into governance. Throughout history, uncrowned power has thrived wherever rulers faced complexity they could not manage alone. The expansion of empires, the intricacies of diplomacy, and the challenges of administration created space for skilled intermediaries. These individuals mastered the arts of persuasion, information, and discretion. They built networks of loyalty, managed rivalries, and ensured continuity when monarchs died or were deposed. Often, their strength came from their ability to appear secondary. By hiding ambition behind service, they avoided direct challenge while accumulating real influence. The difference between rule and influence often lies in visibility. A monarch is bound by expectation and spectacle. Every word and gesture becomes symbolic. The power behind the throne, by contrast, operates in ambiguity. This freedom allows for creativity and maneuver. Because they are not bound by ceremony, such figures can adapt, plot, and negotiate more flexibly. They can shift loyalties, reinterpret orders, and quietly correct mistakes that would destroy a ruler's reputation. In this way, they protect both the state and themselves. Their invisibility is both shield and weapon. Another element that defines uncrowned power is control of knowledge. Throughout the centuries, information has been the currency of influence. Those who managed records, correspondence, and intelligence often shaped policy more than those who signed it. The clerks and secretaries of empires understood the flow of orders, taxes, and secrets. In Elizabethan England, Francis Walsingham's network of spies protected the realm from internal and external threats, giving the crown information that determined survival. Although he served as Secretary of State, his true contribution lay in the unseen mechanisms he built, an intelligence system that allowed the monarchy to anticipate danger. Walsingham's influence marked the beginning of modern statecraft, where information became the foundation of power. In the colonial world, uncrowned power also manifested through local intermediaries. European empires often relied on indigenous leaders, merchants, and interpreters who navigated between cultures. These individuals were essential to governance, though often unacknowledged. In British India, the role of native administrators, or munshis, was central to communication and management. In Africa and the Middle East, local chiefs and advisors acted as the real enforcers of imperial rule, balancing their own interests with those of distant empires. Their authority was unofficial but indispensable, creating a form of shared rule where the empire existed as much in negotiation as in conquest. The invisible architects of empire have also included women, whose influence often operated through personal relationships. In European courts, royal mistresses such as Madame de Pompadour in France wielded political and cultural authority that extended far beyond the private chamber. She supported Enlightenment thinkers, influenced foreign alliances, and directed artistic patronage. In England, figures like Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, shaped the court of Queen and through friendship and persuasion. In Russia, Catherine the Great herself began as a consort but rose to embody the transition from influence to rule. Her early mastery of court politics allowed her to seize power and then govern directly. These stories show that the line between influence and sovereignty is not fixed. Invisible power can, in some cases, become visible authority. The persistence of uncrowned power across civilizations reveals a deep truth about governance. Authority is never absolute, and it rarely belongs entirely to one person. Every ruler depends on others for interpretation, execution, and legitimacy. The myth of solitary rule hides a reality of networks, advisors, and informal systems of persuasion. Whether in ancient courts or modern governments, the process of decision-making is collective, even when the outcome appears singular. The most skilled rulers recognize this and learn to use it. The weakest become captives of those who understand it better than they do. The modern world, with its bureaucracies and media, has not erased the phenomenon of invisible rule, but rather transformed it. Corporate advisors, political consultants, and strategic lobbyists have replaced courtiers and viziers, but the structure of influence remains the same. In democracies, the power behind leaders often lies with policy experts and donors who shape agendas long before they reach public debate. The techniques of persuasion, control of narrative, and mastery of access are the tools of modern uncrowned rulers. Their actions may be governed by law, but their influence is rarely visible. The whisper has become the memo, and the court intrigue has become the political strategy meeting. What makes the study of these invisible architects so compelling is the tension between visibility and control. The visible ruler carries the burden of representation, while the invisible one holds the freedom of maneuver. The balance between them defines the character of governance in every age. When the two work in harmony, empires thrive. When they clash, states falter. History's greatest crises often emerge when the unseen power becomes too visible or when the ruler loses trust in the hand that guides them. The fall of Cromwell, the assassination of Rasputin, the decline of imperial courts, all reveal the fragility of this delicate balance. The allure of crowns and thrones continues to fascinate because it represents authority in its purest form. Yet the truth beneath that allure is more intricate. Empires are not built by symbols alone. They are constructed by intelligence, persuasion, and calculation, often by those whose names are absent from monuments. These invisible architects shape the world through quiet decisions and subtle influence, reminding us that power is not only about command, but also about understanding. The real measure of authority lies not in visibility, but in consequence, the ability to alter events, to move history, even without the weight of a crown. In every age, from pharaonic Egypt to the digital world, the pattern remains. Those who control access, information, and interpretation hold the keys to real power. The figurehead may reign, but the thinker, the advisor, and the strategist rule in substance. Whether they are called vizier, minister, counselor, or aide, their essence is the same. They are the silent builders of authority, the shapers of destiny who operate in the spaces between command and counsel. History may forget their names, but the world they create endures long after the crowns they served have turned to dust. Among the long line of unseen rulers who have guided empires from behind the curtain, Cardinal Richelieu stands as one of the most brilliant and calculating examples. In him, the theme of invisible power reached a peak of precision and purpose. France in the early 17th century was a kingdom torn by noble factions, weakened by religious conflict, and uncertain in its direction. The crown rested on the head of Louis XIII, a man cautious and often insecure, whose reign might have faded into obscurity without the mind that guided it. That mind belonged to Armand Jean Duplessis, later known to history as Cardinal Richelieu, the man who turned France into a modern centralized state and laid the groundwork for the rise of absolute monarchy. His genius was not in royal blood or battlefield triumphs, but in strategy, persuasion, and control of the political machinery. He was the perfect example of an uncrowned ruler, exercising greater command through intellect and manipulation than any king through divine right. Richelieu was born in 1585 to a family of minor nobility. His father's service to the crown provided him a path toward influence, but it was Richelieu's own ambition and intellect that propelled him forward. Originally trained for a military career, he turned toward the church to secure the family's position after his brother, who had been designated for an ecclesiastical post, refused the calling. The young Richelieu studied theology with the same disciplined calculation that would later define his politics. When he was appointed Bishop of Lucan, he quickly demonstrated a talent not only for religious administration, but for political acumen. His loyalty to the crown during the turbulent years of civil conflict between Catholics and Huguenots brought him to the attention of the royal court. What began as a clerical career evolved into a mission to rebuild the authority of the monarchy and restore France's unity. At the time, France was not a coherent state, but a patchwork of noble fiefdoms, independent cities, and religious enclaves. The wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants had torn the nation apart for decades. The crown, though respected in name, lacked effective power in many provinces. Richelieu understood that this disorder could only be solved through centralization, by breaking the power of the nobility and bringing all authority under the control of the king. Yet he also recognized that Louis XIII lacked the will or vision to accomplish this task. Richelieu therefore made himself indispensable, presenting his loyalty as service while quietly taking command of the mechanisms of state. His genius lay in the art of making the monarch believe that every decision was his own, even when it was carefully engineered by Richelieu's mind. When he became the king's chief minister in 1624, Richelieu began a program of reform that transformed France from a feudal realm into a centralized nation. His method was both subtle and ruthless. He reduced the power of the great nobles who had long dominated regional politics. Many of them maintained private armies, fortified castles, and alliances that challenged royal authority. Richelieu ordered the destruction of their fortresses, stripped them of privileges, and replaced hereditary offices with royal appointees loyal to the crown. He established a network of royal officials known as intendants, who carried out the policies of the central government across the provinces. These intendants reported directly to him, bypassing the traditional nobility and ensuring that every part of France was tied to the authority of Paris. It was through this administrative web that Richelieu created the structure of the modern French state. At the same time, he confronted the Huguenots, the Protestant minority whose fortified cities and independent military power posed a threat to unity. His siege of La Rochelle, a Huguenot stronghold, became a defining moment in his policy of consolidation. Though the conflict was cast in religious terms, Richelieu's goal was political: to eliminate any rival power base within France. When La Rochelle finally surrendered after months of resistance, the victory marked the triumph of central authority over local independence. Yet Richelieu's approach was not purely destructive. After subduing the Huguenots, he granted them freedom of worship to prevent renewed civil war. His aim was not persecution but obedience. Religion, like every other force in France, was to serve the state. Richelieu's mastery extended beyond domestic politics into the realm of diplomacy and war. Europe in his time was dominated by the struggle between the Catholic Habsburg dynasties of Spain and Austria, who sought to surround and weaken France. Although Richelieu was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, he saw that the survival of France required opposing the Habsburgs, even if that meant allying with Protestant powers. This pragmatic approach shocked contemporaries who expected religious loyalty to dictate policy, but Richelieu's loyalty was to the nation. He believed that the interests of the state were supreme, a doctrine later known as raison d'etat, the reason of the state. Under his guidance, France entered the 30 Years' War not as a defender of faith, but as a defender of balance in Europe. By supporting Sweden and other Protestant allies against the Habsburgs, Richelieu weakened France's enemies and expanded its influence. This policy reflected a fundamental shift in European politics. Until Richelieu's time, religion had often been the primary justification for war and alliance. He replaced this with a cold realism that placed national power above all other considerations. The idea that a Catholic cardinal would finance Protestant armies to advance the interests of a Catholic kingdom was revolutionary. It demonstrated that politics could be divorced from dogma, that reason and calculation could replace divine mandate as the basis of statecraft. This transformation marked the beginning of modern diplomacy and the secular state. Richelieu's France became a model for later nations that sought stability through centralized control and pragmatic foreign policy rather than religious zeal. Richelieu's domestic reforms were as enduring as his international strategies. He reorganized the army and navy, improved the system of taxation, and brought order to the royal finances. He encouraged the development of commerce and industry, seeing economic strength as essential to national power. Yet he also understood that control of information was as important as control of armies. He founded the French Academy to standardize the language and culture of France, using education and literature to reinforce unity. The Academy's role was not merely scholarly but political. It was part of Richelieu's effort to shape a common national identity under the crown. Through art, architecture, and centralized patronage, he cultivated a vision of France that celebrated the monarchy and diminished regional distinctions. His relationship with Louis XIII was complex, marked by dependence, rivalry, and mutual suspicion. The king often resented Richelieu's dominance, but could not rule without him. Richelieu managed this delicate balance through a mixture of loyalty and manipulation. He surrounded the king with loyalists who reported back to him, ensuring that no plot or intrigue could threaten his position. When the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, and other courtiers conspired to remove him, Richelieu acted swiftly, using his control of intelligence and military force to crush opposition. His survival through repeated crises revealed not only his strategic genius, but his deep understanding of the psychology of power. He knew that authority was sustained not by affection but by fear and respect, and he maintained both in equal measure. Richelieu's enemies were numerous. The nobility despised him for curtailing their privileges, the clergy mistrusted his worldliness, and foreign courts accused him of hypocrisy. Yet none could match his ability to turn adversity into advantage. Each conspiracy he uncovered strengthened his control. His spies operated across France and beyond, feeding him information that allowed him to anticipate every threat. He built a bureaucracy loyal to himself rather than to individual families or factions. The image of Richelieu as the Red Eminence, cloaked in crimson robes and surrounded by secret agents, became a symbol of modern statecraft, efficient, calculating, and merciless when necessary. Through this machinery of surveillance and discipline, he forged a new understanding of governance. That power must be informed, coordinated, and centralized to endure. Despite his apparent ruthlessness, Richelieu was not driven solely by ambition. His writings reveal a vision of the state as a living organism, where disorder threatened existence itself. He saw his mission as the salvation of France through discipline and structure. To him, the crown represented not a person, but an institution that must be preserved at all costs. His service to Louis XIII was therefore both personal and ideological. He sought to create a monarchy so strong that it could survive weak kings, rebellious nobles, and foreign threats alike. In this, he succeeded. By the time of his death in 1642, France had emerged as a unified and powerful nation, poised to become the leading force in Europe under Louis XIV. Richelieu's legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. The system he created became the foundation of absolute monarchy in France. His successor, Cardinal Mazarin, continued his policies, guiding the young Louis XIV until the king himself assumed full control. The Sun King's famous declaration, "I am the state," was in many ways the culmination of Richelieu's vision. The bureaucracy, military reforms, and diplomatic strategies that defined Louis's reign were all built on Richelieu's framework. Even as the monarchy later collapsed in revolution, the administrative and political systems he designed survived, shaping modern France's government for centuries. His belief in the supremacy of the state over all other institutions became a defining principle of modern politics. The influence of Richelieu also reached beyond France. His doctrine of state interest over religious or moral considerations inspired later thinkers, such as Machiavelli, had anticipated it in theory, but Richelieu proved it in practice. His blend of reason and ruthlessness influenced European diplomacy for generations. Statesmen like Otto von Bismarck in Germany and Metternich in Austria would later employ similar principles, balancing alliances and manipulating rivals in the pursuit of national stability. The idea that the ends of the state justify the means, while morally contested, became a cornerstone of political realism. Richelieu's career stands as an early and powerful example of how intellect and calculation can shape the destiny of nations more deeply than charisma or inheritance. Yet behind this grand legacy lies a more personal story of ambition and endurance. Richelieu's health was fragile for much of his life. He suffered from recurring illnesses that often left him bedridden. Despite physical weakness, he maintained an iron will, dictating orders from his chambers and managing crises through sheer determination. His self-discipline, perhaps more than his intellect, defined his character. He lived as if sustained by purpose alone, convinced that his work was essential to France's survival. In his final years, he grew aware of his unpopularity but accepted it as the cost of service. "If they hate me," he is reported to have said, "it is because I have done the work." Such stoicism reflected his understanding of leadership, that greatness often demands isolation and sacrifice. When Richelieu died in Paris, France mourned a statesman more than a priest. His red robes, once symbols of ecclesiastical authority, had become emblems of political mastery. The king, though relieved to be free of his powerful minister, recognized that he had lost the architect of his reign. Within months, the void Richelieu left behind was filled by Mazarin, proving how necessary such a guiding hand was to the stability of the throne. Richelieu's memory continued to dominate French political thought, inspiring admiration and fear in equal measure. To his supporters, he was the savior of France. To his enemies, he was the embodiment of tyranny. Yet even his critics acknowledged his genius. His combination of vision and control had turned chaos into order, laying the foundations of the modern state. Centuries later, historians and dramatists still grapple with Richelieu's legacy. In literature, he often appears as the archetypal schemer, cold, manipulative, and omniscient. But beneath the myth lies a more complex truth. Richelieu was not merely a manipulator, but a reformer who understood that power must be organized to serve a higher purpose. He believed that personal ambition, if aligned with national interest, could become a force for stability. His methods were harsh, but his results were enduring. The France he left behind was not only stronger, but more coherent, a nation capable of sustaining its identity through wars, revolutions, and social change. In the larger story of the invisible architects of empire, Richelieu represents the moment when hidden power became systematized. Earlier figures had ruled through personal influence or charisma, but Richelieu institutionalized invisibility itself. He built structures that allowed power to operate beyond the person of the monarch, embedding authority in bureaucracy and law. This was his true genius, to transform personal dominance into lasting institutions. Through this transformation, he ensured that the principles of control, discipline, and centralization would outlive him. His France was not the product of one man's will, but the beginning of a modern state that could function without a visible ruler. The spirit of Richelieu, in this sense, continued long after his death, living on in every government that values order over chaos, planning over chance, and reason over passion. The echo of his work can still be heard today. Modern states, whether democratic or authoritarian, rely on centralized administration, professional bureaucracy, and calculated diplomacy, all hallmarks of Richelieu's vision. The idea that policy must be guided by national interest rather than personal morality remains a defining feature of international relations. In every capital where advisors whisper behind leaders, where intelligence shapes strategy, and where unseen experts craft decisions, the legacy of Richelieu endures. He was the embodiment of power without spectacle, of mastery without inheritance. In him, the crown found its mind, and through him, France found its modern form. Cardinal Richelieu's life closes the circle begun by countless invisible rulers before him. He was both servant and sovereign, priest and statesman, philosopher and tactician. He proved that true authority does not depend on appearance, but on understanding. His rise from minor nobility to the pinnacle of power illustrates how intellect, discipline, and patience can surpass birthright and fortune. In shaping the destiny of France, he became a model for all who would rule from the shadows. The architect of absolute monarchy, the founder of statecraft, and the first modern minister, Richelieu stands as the ultimate example of the mastermind behind the throne, a man who, without wearing a crown, taught the world what it truly means to govern. If Cardinal Richelieu represented the intellectual mastery of power behind the throne in the Western world, the East produced its own counterpart in the figure of Empress Dowager Cixi of China. Her rise and rule revealed another form of invisible authority, one exercised through tradition, intuition, and survival within a world that was not built to acknowledge female power. Cixi's reign over the Qing dynasty spanned nearly half a century, during which she transformed from a young concubine in the imperial palace to the most dominant political figure in China. She ruled a vast empire without ever wearing a crown or claiming the title of emperor, yet her will directed the course of the nation in an age of turmoil, reform, and confrontation with the modern world. She was in every sense an uncrowned monarch, commanding, complex, and controversial. Cixi was born in 1835 into a minor Manchu family of the Yahenra clan, far from the centers of power in Beijing. Her early life gave little indication of the influence she would later wield. At 17, she entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor. Life within the imperial harem was a world of ritual, confinement, and hidden rivalry. The emperor's favor determined a woman's future, and Cixi quickly proved herself both perceptive and ambitious. She learned the intricate hierarchy of the court, where gestures, words, and silences could determine life or death. In that confined world, she developed the subtle skills of persuasion and manipulation that would later serve her in politics. When she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son in 1856, her position changed overnight. She became the mother of the heir, and thus secured a place in the imperial future. In a palace ruled by men but shaped by women's intrigues, motherhood was the gateway to power. When the Xianfeng Emperor died in 1861, China stood on the brink of collapse. The country had suffered humiliating defeats in the Opium Wars, foreign armies had invaded Beijing, and internal rebellions such as the Taiping movement threatened the dynasty's survival. The new emperor, Cixi's 5-year-old son Tongji, was too young to rule. Power fell into the hands of regents chosen by the late emperor, but Cixi and the senior empress, Xian, refused to remain silent figureheads. In one of the most dramatic political maneuvers in Chinese history, Cixi organized what became known as the Xinyo coup. With the support of loyal palace eunuchs and key military officers, she seized control of the imperial seals, declared the regents guilty of treason, and had them executed. The coup established her as co-regent alongside Xian, ruling in the name of the child emperor. It was the first act of a woman who would learn to master the balance between tradition and transformation. Cixi's rise reflected both her intelligence and her ability to exploit the rigid structures of the Qing court. As a woman, she could not sit on the throne or appear in official audiences, but she used her position as mother of the emperor, the Empress Dowager, to exercise influence indirectly. She held audiences from behind a silk screen, hidden from view, while male officials addressed her as if speaking to the boy emperor. Behind that screen, she listened, questioned, and made decisions that shaped the empire. Her power was rooted in her role as guardian of the dynasty, a role that allowed her to control the throne while appearing to serve it. Like Richelieu before her, she understood that authority often works best when disguised as duty. The Qing dynasty she inherited was a vast and fragile empire struggling to survive in a changing world. Western powers demanded trade concessions, extraterritorial privileges, and territorial control. The Taiping Rebellion had devastated southern China, killing millions and exposing the weakness of imperial authority. Corruption was rampant, and the bureaucracy was paralyzed by tradition. Cixi's challenge was immense: to preserve the dynasty's legitimacy while adapting to a new global order. Her solution was a blend of reform and conservatism, innovation tempered by control. She recognized that modernization was necessary, but feared that too rapid a change would destroy the cultural and political foundations of the empire. In the early years of her regency, she relied heavily on able officials who shared her vision of cautious reform. One of them was Prince Gong, who had negotiated the peace treaties with Britain and France after the invasion of Beijing. Together, they established the Zhongli Yamen, China's first modern foreign affairs office, marking a tentative step toward diplomacy based on negotiation rather than isolation. Cixi supported the self-strengthening movement, which aimed to adopt Western technology while preserving Chinese values. New arsenals, shipyards, and schools were founded. Students were sent abroad to study science and engineering. Railways and telegraph lines began to appear, symbols of a new age cautiously entering the ancient empire. Yet Cixi ensured that every reform remained under imperial supervision. She permitted modernization only to the extent that it did not threaten her control. For her, progress was acceptable only when it served authority. Her reign was marked by a delicate dance between adaptation and preservation. She faced pressure from reformers who wanted deeper change and conservatives who resisted any departure from tradition. Cixi positioned herself between these forces, shifting alliances when necessary to maintain balance. She could be ruthless when challenged, but she also showed flexibility rare among rulers of her era. When the young Emperor Tongji came of age, she formally handed him power, but he died only 2 years later without an heir. Once again, the throne was vacant, and Cixi acted swiftly to install her 3-year-old nephew, who became the Guangxu Emperor. By making herself regent once more, she secured another generation of influence. She claimed to serve the dynasty, but in truth the dynasty served her. Under Cixi's rule, the imperial court became a theater of invisible power. She commanded absolute loyalty from her inner circle of eunuchs and advisors, who managed the flow of information and ensured her will was carried out. Ministers who opposed her found their careers destroyed or their lives endangered. Yet she was not merely a despot, she was a strategist. Her ability to read people and foresee political shifts allowed her to survive repeated crises. When reformers attempted to curtail her authority, she countered with patience and precision, waiting until the moment of advantage before striking back. She understood the rhythm of court politics, where appearance often mattered more than action. In this, she resembled Richelieu's mastery of timing and control, each decision calculated to preserve the core of power while allowing the illusion of continuity. Cixi's reputation in Western accounts was long overshadowed by caricature. To foreign observers, she became the Dragon Lady, a symbol of Oriental despotism, portrayed as cruel, greedy, and reactionary. This image, shaped by missionaries and diplomats who resented her resistance to foreign influence, ignored the complexity of her position. In reality, Cixi was neither a villain nor a simple conservative. She was a pragmatic ruler navigating an empire caught between collapse and renewal. Her decisions were shaped not by malice, but by a deep understanding of China's cultural and political fabric. She believed that too much Western intrusion would destroy the Confucian order that held the empire together. Her policies, often condemned as obstructionist, were attempts to preserve sovereignty in an age of imperialism. As the century progressed, the pressure for reform grew. By the 1890s, China's defeats in wars with Western powers and with Japan exposed the limits of partial modernization. The loss of Korea and the rise of Japan as a regional power shocked the court. Reform-minded scholars and officials, inspired by Western political ideas, urged the Guangxu Emperor to implement sweeping changes. The 100 Days Reform of 1898 sought to modernize the bureaucracy, the military, and education. Cixi initially tolerated the movement, but soon saw it as a threat to her authority. The young emperor, influenced by reformers like Kang Yue, attempted to bypass her control and establish direct rule. Sensing danger, Cixi acted decisively. She placed the emperor under house arrest in the Forbidden City, executed or exiled the reformers, and reclaimed full power. Her response was not simply reactionary. It was the instinct of a ruler who believed that uncontrolled reform would lead to revolution. Her suppression of the movement preserved the dynasty temporarily, but also deepened the divide between tradition and modernity. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 brought that tension to its breaking point. Secret societies, enraged by foreign dominance and missionary activity, rose in violent revolt, attacking foreigners and Chinese converts to Christianity. The movement began as a grassroots uprising, but soon spiraled into national crisis. Cixi, seeing an opportunity to assert independence from foreign powers, declared support for the Boxers and ordered war against the Western legations in Beijing. The decision proved disastrous. A coalition of 8 foreign nations invaded, occupied the capital, and forced the Qing court into exile. The humiliation that followed was immense. China was forced to pay massive indemnities and grant further concessions. Yet even in defeat, Cixi displayed resilience. She returned to Beijing after peace was restored and began another phase of cautious reform, recognizing that survival required adaptation. Railroads were expanded, the civil service examination system was abolished, and new schools based on Western models were opened. For the first time, discussions of constitutional government entered imperial politics. Cixi, once seen as the defender of tradition, now became the reluctant architect of change. Her later years revealed a ruler both weary and wise, aware that the world had shifted beyond her control. She sought to modernize without surrendering the throne's authority, but time and history were against her. The Qing dynasty was burdened by corruption, inefficiency, and growing revolutionary sentiment. The rise of nationalist movements and the influence of Western-educated Chinese intellectuals signaled that imperial rule itself was nearing its end. Yet Cixi maintained her grip on power until the final days of her life. When she died in 1908, only a day after the death of the Guangxu emperor, the dynasty she had held together for nearly 50 years began its final descent. Within 3 years, the Qing fell, and 2,000 years of imperial rule in China came to an end. Cixi's legacy remains one of the most debated in Chinese history. To some, she was a tyrant who clung to power and resisted progress, dooming the empire to decline. To others, she was a formidable leader who preserved Chinese sovereignty against overwhelming odds. The truth lies somewhere between these extremes. Cixi ruled a civilization on the edge of transformation, caught between the demands of tradition and the forces of modernity. Her caution delayed reform, but her pragmatism prevented disintegration. Without her, the Qing dynasty might have collapsed decades earlier under the weight of rebellion and foreign domination. Her life illustrates the paradox of invisible rule, the need to act decisively while appearing deferential, to command through persuasion rather than decree. She was not an empress in title, but she governed as one in every sense. The parallels between Cixi and Richelieu are striking despite their cultural distance. Both rose from modest origins to become the guiding minds of their nations. Both understood that stability required centralization and control of information. Both ruled through others while remaining themselves half-concealed. Yet where Richelieu's world rewarded intellect and discipline within a male hierarchy, Cixi's demanded that power be hidden behind obedience. Her achievement lay in turning the limitations of gender and tradition into instruments of rule. By embracing the image of the devoted mother and guardian of the dynasty, she transformed submission into authority. Her reign thus represents one of the most profound examples of how invisible power can transcend social boundaries and reshape history. In many ways, Cixi's life also embodies the contradictions of empire itself. She sought to preserve the old order while using the tools of modernity to defend it. She embraced technology but distrusted ideology. She modernized the army and administration but kept the throne untouched. This tension mirrored China's broader struggle to reconcile its ancient civilization with the demands of the modern world. Her cautious reforms anticipated the challenges that would face later Chinese leaders as they sought to define progress without losing identity. Even her failures became lessons for the generations that followed, teaching that modernization cannot succeed without political openness and that stability purchased through fear eventually erodes from within. The world remembered her through many lenses: imperialist propaganda, court gossip, nationalist revisionism. But beneath these portrayals was a woman of extraordinary political talent. She navigated a system designed to exclude her, mastered the machinery of an empire, and maintained power longer than most emperors in Chinese history. Her authority came not from divine mandate or military conquest, but from intellect, instinct, and a deep understanding of human nature. She knew when to yield and when to strike, when to appear merciful and when to be ruthless. Every gesture in her court, every appointment, every decree was part of a larger design: the preservation of the dynasty and, by extension, herself. In the quiet chambers of the Forbidden City, surrounded by walls of silence and ceremony, Cixi embodied the essence of invisible rule. Her voice, calm and measured, decided the fate of millions, yet she was seen by few outside her court. Foreign ambassadors, allowed only brief audiences, described her presence as commanding but enigmatic. She spoke through intermediaries, but her words carried the full weight of the empire. Like Richelieu's whispers in the council chambers of France, Cixi's unseen influence reached every corner of the state. The throne was her stage, but her power lay behind it, sustained by secrecy, intellect, and endurance. In the long history of empire, few figures have managed to wield such extensive authority without formal sovereignty. Cixi ruled as an empress in everything but name, directing armies, appointing ministers, negotiating with foreign powers, and shaping the ideology of her nation. She demonstrated that the art of governance is not confined to visible office, but rests on the mastery of perception and control. Her life was a testament to the enduring truth that the most powerful rulers are often those who understand how to hide their power. As the twilight of the Qing dynasty faded into the dawn of modern China, Cixi's shadow lingered. The bureaucratic structures she refined, the diplomacy she shaped, and the cautious modernization she initiated became part of China's path toward the future. Her contradictions mirrored those of the empire she ruled, proud, ancient, struggling to adapt yet unwilling to surrender. She died as she had lived, commanding respect and fear, her name whispered through the corridors of history as both guardian and obstacle. Like the great ministers and counselors before her, she left behind a world transformed by her presence. The story of Empress Dowager Cixi closes another chapter in the saga of the invisible architects of power. From the courts of Europe to the palaces of Asia, from Richelieu's council chamber to Cixi's silk-draped throne room, the pattern remains the same. True power often belongs not to those who appear to hold it, but to those who understand how to shape it unseen. Cixi's rule reminds us that the throne is only as strong as the mind behind it, and that in every empire, there exists a figure who governs from the shadows, unseen but unyielding. In her long and formidable life, she proved that mastery of the unseen can shape nations more enduringly than the crowns of kings. If Empress Dowager Cixi ruled through the delicate balance of secrecy and symbolism in the Forbidden City, Otto von Bismarck commanded power in a very different world. Yet the essence of their rule was the same. Both mastered the art of indirect power. Where Cixi cloaked authority in ritual, Bismarck concealed it within bureaucracy. Where she navigated a world that excluded women from sovereignty, he maneuvered among kings, princes, and parliaments that claimed authority but often depended entirely on his judgment. In the age of empires and revolutions, when monarchs still reigned but no longer ruled with absolute control, Bismarck showed that political power could be reshaped through intellect, strategy, and manipulation rather than crowns or bloodlines. Otto von Bismarck was born in 1815 in Skonhausen, Prussia, into a minor noble family that valued discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty to the king. His early years gave few signs of the political genius he would later display. Educated in law at Göttingen and Berlin, he entered the Prussian civil service, but soon grew restless with bureaucratic routine. His sharp tongue and disdain for convention earned him the nickname, the Mad Junker. Yet beneath the surface of arrogance lay a mind of rare clarity. He understood instinctively that Prussia's strength lay not only in its army, but in the careful manipulation of alliances, rivalries, and perception. He would later describe politics as the art of the possible, a phrase that captured both his realism and his pragmatism. In the middle decades of the 19th century, Germany was not yet a unified nation, but a loose collection of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states bound together by the German Confederation. The dream of unification had haunted the German imagination since the Napoleonic Wars, but it remained unrealized because of rivalries between Austria and Prussia. Austria, the traditional leader of German-speaking Europe, sought to maintain dominance, while Prussia aspired to modernize and expand. The revolutions of 1848 had shaken Europe, but failed to produce a united Germany. Liberal nationalists had dreamed of a constitutional monarchy, but their efforts were crushed by conservative forces. Into this fractured world stepped Bismarck, a man who would forge unity not through idealism, but through calculation, coercion, and cunning. Bismarck first gained prominence as Prussia's representative to the German Confederation in Frankfurt. There he observed the complex interplay of power among the German states and learned to manipulate it to Prussia's advantage. He realized that unification could not be achieved through speeches or parliamentary resolutions, but only through controlled conflict. He once said that the great questions of the age would be decided not by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. Though often quoted as evidence of militarism, the phrase reflected his belief that political will and controlled force, rather than sentiment or theory, determined history. For Bismarck, war was not an end but a tool, an instrument of diplomacy used with precision and restraint. In 1862, King Wilhelm I of Prussia appointed Bismarck as minister-president, the equivalent of prime minister, during a constitutional crisis. The Prussian parliament had refused to approve funding for military reforms, fearing the king sought to expand royal authority. Bismarck resolved the crisis not through negotiation, but through bold defiance. He collected taxes and implemented reforms without parliamentary approval, arguing that the government must continue to function even without consent. His action provoked outrage among liberals, but secured the army's loyalty and demonstrated his readiness to act decisively. In this confrontation, Bismarck revealed his fundamental principle: legitimacy mattered less than results. Power, once seized, could justify itself through. Over the next decade, Bismarck orchestrated a sequence of conflicts that reshaped Europe. Each war was calculated not for conquest, but for political outcome. The first was the war against Denmark in 1864, fought jointly with Austria over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Bismarck's aim was not merely territorial gain, but to provoke rivalry with Austria. When victory was achieved, he used the division of the conquered territories to sow discord between the Allies. The second stage came in 1866, when he engineered the Austro-Prussian War. By isolating Austria diplomatically, securing neutrality from Russia, and winning tacit support from Italy, Bismarck ensured that Prussia could strike without fear of coalition. The war lasted only 7 weeks, but transformed the German political landscape. Austria was defeated and excluded from German affairs, leaving Prussia dominant. Rather than humiliating Austria, Bismarck offered lenient peace terms, understanding that future stability required reconciliation. He replaced the old confederation with the North German Confederation, uniting the northern states under Prussian leadership. Through diplomacy and limited war, he achieved what decades of nationalist agitation had failed to deliver. The final step came with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Bismarck knew that German unity required a common enemy that could rally both northern and southern states. By manipulating diplomatic correspondence, the famous EMS dispatch, he provoked France into declaring war on Prussia. The conflict united the German states in defense of their homeland and produced a swift and decisive victory. In January 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, King Wilhelm was proclaimed German emperor, and the German Empire was born. Yet even at that moment of triumph, it was clear that the true architect of the new order was not the emperor, but the chancellor standing beside him. Bismarck had achieved unification without claiming the throne, ruling through persuasion, manipulation, and strategic mastery. He had become the embodiment of the unseen power that governs through others. Bismarck's genius lay not only in conquest, but in the consolidation of peace. After unification, he turned from expansion to preservation. He recognized that a newly unified Germany, powerful yet vulnerable, needed stability to endure. His task was to prevent alliances from forming against the empire and to maintain equilibrium in Europe. To achieve this, he constructed a complex system of treaties, alliances, and understandings known as the Bismarckian system. It was a diplomatic web designed to isolate France, maintain friendly relations with Russia and Austria, and preserve peace through balance. He believed that Germany's security depended on restraint, not aggression. In one of his most famous remarks, he warned that preventive war was like committing suicide for fear of death. His diplomacy was subtle, flexible, and always guided by calculation rather than ideology. Domestically, Bismarck faced challenges of a different kind. The empire he created was a mosaic of states, religions, and social classes. National unity had been achieved, but political unity remained fragile. The new constitution granted power to the emperor and the chancellor while limiting parliamentary influence. Yet Bismarck understood that control required not only authority, but legitimacy. To secure his position, he alternately courted and suppressed different factions. When the Catholic Church, under the leadership of Pope Pius IX, sought to assert influence over German politics, Bismarck launched the Kulturkampf, a struggle for control between church and state. He enacted laws to expel Jesuits, restrict clerical education, and bring church appointments under state oversight. The campaign provoked resistance and ultimately failed to subdue Catholic loyalty, forcing Bismarck to compromise. But the episode demonstrated his willingness to confront powerful institutions when he believed they threatened national cohesion. Later, facing the rise of socialism and the growing power of the working class, Bismarck again used a blend of repression and reform. He introduced the anti-socialist laws, banning socialist organizations and publications, yet simultaneously pioneered social welfare policies. Under his direction, Germany became the first modern state to implement health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions. These measures, introduced in the 1880s, were intended not from humanitarian impulse, but from political calculation. Bismarck sought to undercut socialist appeal by addressing the grievances that fueled it. He recognized that stability required not only force but also foresight. By co-opting reform, he preserved order. His approach embodied the art of indirect rule, achieving political control by shaping society's structure rather than through overt domination. Bismarck's relationship with Emperor Wilhelm I was one of mutual dependence. The king trusted his chancellor's judgment and allowed him wide latitude in government. Yet this harmony depended on Bismarck's careful management of royal ego. He flattered, advised, and occasionally defied his sovereign, but always ensured that the monarch appeared supreme. It was a delicate balance, authority in the emperor's name, power in Bismarck's hands. He understood that influence is most effective when it does not threaten its source. Like Richelieu with Louis XIII or Cixi with her emperors, Bismarck governed through others while ensuring that his own authority remained indispensable. When Wilhelm I died in 1888, his successor, Frederick III, reigned only a few months before succumbing to illness. The throne then passed to Wilhelm II, a young, ambitious, and impetuous ruler who resented the dominance of his chancellor. Wilhelm viewed himself as a modern monarch destined to lead personally, not merely to reign. Conflict between the two men was inevitable. Bismarck, accustomed to command, found it difficult to adjust to the new emperor's temperament. Their disagreements over foreign and domestic policy deepened until, in 1890, Wilhelm dismissed Bismarck from office. It was the end of an era. The man who had built Germany's empire was removed by the very structure he had created. In retirement, Bismarck watched as his successors dismantled much of his careful diplomacy. The web of alliances he had designed to preserve peace began to unravel. Germany's new leadership pursued more aggressive policies that eventually led to the catastrophe of the First World War. Bismarck himself foresaw the danger, warning that a major European war would arise from some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. His prediction came true 2 decades after his death. The irony of his career is that the empire he forged through realism and restraint later destroyed itself through ambition and arrogance. Yet Bismarck's legacy cannot be measured solely by the wars or treaties of his time. His true achievement lay in redefining the nature of power in the modern state. He demonstrated that authority need not rest on hereditary right or divine sanction, but on mastery of institutions, information, and timing. He was not a monarch but wielded more power than many kings. His rule showed how the machinery of government could be bent to the will of a single mind without open despotism. Through diplomacy, bureaucracy, and calculated persuasion, he shaped the destiny of a continent while maintaining the appearance of constitutional order. He transformed the chancellorship into an instrument of real governance, leaving the emperor as a figurehead for public unity while he controlled the levers of administration. This was indirect rule refined into an art form. Bismarck's political philosophy was rooted in realism. He rejected both liberal idealism and revolutionary radicalism, believing that politics must be guided by necessity rather than moral aspiration. He once remarked that he would never die for an idea, only for his country. Yet this pragmatism did not make him cynical. He saw the state as a living organism whose survival depended on adaptability. His policies, though often ruthless, were aimed at preserving order in a world of change. He understood that revolution could be prevented only by granting reform, that peace required preparedness, and that diplomacy demanded credibility as well as cunning. His success lay in knowing when to act and when to wait, when to compromise and when to strike. The image of Bismarck as the Iron Chancellor captures only part of his character. Beneath the stern exterior was a man of wit, charm, and deep sensitivity. He was a devoted husband and father, a lover of conversation and rural life. Yet he carried a sense of isolation, aware that his position demanded solitude. He once confessed that power was like being on a high mountain. The view was magnificent, but no one else could stand beside him. In that loneliness lay the paradox of all rulers who govern indirectly. Their authority depends on invisibility, but their isolation grows with each act of control. Like Cixi behind her screen or Richelieu in his council chamber, Bismarck understood that to command truly, one must often remain unseen. By the time of his death in 1898, Europe had entered the age of modern politics. Monarchs still wore crowns, but real power increasingly lay with ministers, parliaments, and bureaucrats. The model Bismarck had created, a strong, centralized state guided by professional administration, became the foundation of modern governance. His methods influenced leaders far beyond Germany, from European diplomats to Asian reformers seeking to modernize their own nations. Even those who opposed his conservatism studied his strategy. His combination of realism, patience, and precision became a textbook for statesmen in an age of uncertainty. The story of Bismarck completes a pattern that runs through history's greatest empires. Power rarely belongs entirely to those who seem to hold it. From the secluded courts of the East to the marble halls of Europe, authority often depends on those who understand how to direct it without claiming it. Bismarck's life proves that mastery of the indirect can be more enduring than the possession of a throne. He ruled not by divine right, but by force of intellect, shaping events through persuasion, calculation, and control. In the empire he built, as in all great empires, the true strength of rule lay not in the symbol of sovereignty, but in the invisible hand that guided it. When Otto von Bismarck demonstrated that states could be forged not only through the clash of armies, but also through the precision of diplomacy, he revealed that power did not always depend on battlefields. Yet, even before the age of nation-states, others had already mastered subtler instruments of dominance. Some ruled through credit rather than conquest, others through faith rather than force, and some through commerce that reached farther than any army could march. Across the centuries, money and belief proved to be two of the most enduring foundations of unseen authority. In this realm, crowns were unnecessary, and thrones could be made of coin or creed. Among the earliest and most brilliant practitioners of such indirect rule stood Cosimo de Medici of Florence. In the 15th century, when the Italian peninsula was divided into city-states, each vying for wealth, art, and influence, Florence emerged as a beacon of culture and commerce. Officially a republic governed by elected councils, Florence prided itself on liberty. Yet beneath this republican facade, one family's financial empire shaped every decision that mattered. The Medici Bank, founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, became one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe. Through loans to monarchs and popes, it established a web of obligations that reached from London to Rome. Giovanni's son Cosimo inherited not only immense wealth but also a vision that power secured through debt could last longer than power seized by sword. Cosimo understood that influence worked best when exercised quietly. Though his rivals accused him of ambition, he held no royal title and rarely appeared to command. Instead, he cultivated loyalty through patronage. By financing public works, supporting artists, and funding religious institutions, he created a network of gratitude that bound the city to him. He commissioned the construction of churches such as San Lorenzo, sponsored architects like Brunelleschi, and supported scholars translating ancient texts. These acts were not merely displays of taste, but instruments of control. Every artist, priest, and merchant who benefited from his generosity became an informal ally. In a world where wealth often provoked suspicion, Cosimo perfected the art of humility. He dressed modestly, avoided open displays of luxury, and claimed to be nothing more than a servant of the Republic. Yet from his palazzo, designed by Michelozzo as a symbol of both power and restraint, he orchestrated Florence's politics with unmatched skill. He financed candidates, manipulated guilds, and ensured that his supporters filled the city's governing councils. When rivals tried to exile him in 1343, his absence revealed how deeply the city depended on him. Without his banking network, trade slowed and credit evaporated. Within a year, the Florentines begged him to return, acknowledging that the Republic could not function without its unacknowledged ruler. Cosimo's method of governance combined pragmatism and vision. He believed that stability came not from coercion, but from balance. By maintaining Florence's independence amid the rivalries of Milan, Venice, and the papacy, he ensured prosperity while avoiding destructive wars. His foreign policy was one of calculated neutrality, preserving peace while allowing commerce to flourish. Yet he was no idealist. When conspiracies threatened him, he acted decisively, exiling opponents or stripping them of wealth. He built alliances through marriages and trade agreements, extending the Medici reach across Europe. Perhaps his greatest legacy lay in his understanding of culture as a form of political capital. The artists and thinkers he supported helped shape the Renaissance, but their creations also served as instruments of soft power. The beauty of Florence became a reflection of Medici virtue, and the family's image intertwined with the city's identity. By turning patronage into propaganda, Cosimo ensured that his descendants would inherit not only wealth but legitimacy. The Medici line would later produce popes, queens, and dukes, but their foundation rested on the vision of the man known simply as Cosimo the Elder, the banker who ruled a republic by the force of obligation and gratitude. While Cosimo demonstrated the power of finance within a single city, the papacy embodied an authority that transcended borders altogether. Long before modern states existed, the Church of Rome commanded a form of allegiance that no monarch could equal. Among its most consequential leaders was Pope Urban II, whose reign at the end of the 11th century reshaped the political map of Europe through faith. His power did not rest on armies under his command, but on the ability to move men's hearts and minds. When he called for the First Crusade in the year 1095, he demonstrated that spiritual authority could mobilize entire nations toward a common cause. The world into which Urban spoke was one of fragmentation. Western Europe was divided among feudal lords, and the Byzantine Empire faced threats from the Seljuk Turks. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land had become dangerous, and reports of persecution stirred outrage among Christians. Urban saw in this crisis both a moral duty and a political opportunity. In November of that year, at the Council of Clermont, he delivered a sermon that electrified Europe. He urged knights and peasants alike to take up the cross, promising forgiveness of sins for those who fought to reclaim Jerusalem. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the continent, men sold their lands, forged weapons, and took holy vows. Entire armies of believers marched east, driven not by royal command but by faith. Urban's genius lay in transforming spiritual devotion into political movement. By channeling Europe's violence outward, he not only advanced religious goals but also strengthened the papacy's moral supremacy. For centuries, popes had struggled to assert independence from kings and emperors. Urban reversed the relationship. Monarchs found themselves responding to his call rather than issuing their own. The crusade united rivals under a single banner and redefined the idea of Christendom as a collective identity beyond borders. It also revealed that belief could be a more powerful mobilizer than law or fear. The consequences of his call extended far beyond his lifetime. The Crusades reshaped trade routes, stimulated intellectual exchange between East and West, and left an enduring mark on the European imagination. But they also demonstrated the dual nature of religious power. The same authority that inspired devotion could justify conquest. Urban's appeal sanctified war, turning it into a spiritual duty. For centuries afterward, rulers would invoke divine sanction to legitimize expansion, persecution, or reform. Yet behind these campaigns lay a truth Urban had grasped instinctively. Faith, once organized and directed, could move masses more effectively than any standing army. Urban II's influence cannot be measured merely by the Crusades' outcome. His real achievement was to transform the papacy into a political institution commanding both conscience and policy. The popes who followed inherited a new kind of sovereignty, one based not on territory but on belief. Through excommunication, they could humble kings. Through indulgences, they could finance cathedrals and wars. In this way, the Church became both a spiritual and economic empire, sustained by tithes, pilgrimages, and trade in relics and indulgences. The line between piety and power blurred, and the Vatican emerged as one of the most enduring centers of authority in history. Urban's legacy thus stands alongside that of Cosimo de Medici in demonstrating that control can flow from less tangible sources, faith and finance, yet shape nations as decisively as force. Both men understood the psychology of allegiance. Cosimo bound people through obligation, Urban through salvation. Each redefined the concept of rule, one through the ledger, the other through the pulpit. As centuries passed and Europe entered the age of industry and capital, the locus of power shifted again. Monarchies waned, and governments yielded increasing influence to those who controlled money on a global scale. In the modern world, bankers became the new princes, their empires built not on land or armies, but on credit, industry, and trust. At the turn of the 20th century, no figure embodied this transformation more completely than John Pierpont Morgan. Known simply as J.P. Morgan, he stood as the most powerful financier of his age, a man whose influence reached from Wall Street to the White House, shaping the destiny of the United States and the wider world without ever holding public office. Morgan was born in 1837 in Connecticut, the son of a successful international banker. Educated in mathematics and finance, he entered the family business and quickly demonstrated extraordinary organizational ability. In an era of rapid industrial expansion, he recognized that America's fragmented economy needed structure. Railroads, the backbone of commerce, were chaotic, overbuilt, mismanaged, and often bankrupt. Morgan saw in their disorder an opportunity. By reorganizing bankrupt lines, consolidating ownership, and stabilizing finances, he imposed order on chaos. He turned competition into coordination, creating networks that stretched across the continent. Through a combination of negotiation and coercion, he persuaded rival owners to accept his terms, arguing that cooperation would yield prosperity for all. It was a modern echo of Cosimo's logic: stability through control disguised as partnership. His methods were not always gentle, but they were effective. By the 1890s, Morgan's banking house had become the unofficial central bank of the United States. When the government lacked a formal mechanism to stabilize the economy, Morgan filled the void. During the financial panic of 1893, he organized a rescue of the federal treasury by arranging the sale of gold to replenish reserves. A decade later, in the panic of 1907, he summoned the leading financiers of New York to his library and forced them to cooperate in saving the banking system. His authority was purely moral, yet his command was absolute. President Theodore Roosevelt himself later admitted that Morgan had acted as a man of power, who preserved the nation's credit when the government could not. Morgan's reach extended beyond finance into industry and politics. He financed the creation of General Electric, merged steel companies to form United States Steel, and supported telegraph and shipping enterprises. His philosophy was rooted in order and efficiency. He despised speculation and valued stability above all. He believed that unchecked competition threatened the economy's health, much as Bismarck had believed that unrestrained ideology threatened the state. To Morgan, consolidation was not merely profitable, it was patriotic. By bringing order to industry, he believed he served the national interest. Yet his dominance provoked unease. Critics accused him of creating monopolies and undermining democracy. The press called him the Emperor of Wall Street, suggesting that his power rivaled that of elected officials. Despite his wealth, Morgan's personal life was austere. He collected art and manuscripts, built libraries and churches, and supported philanthropy, but he lived without ostentation. Like Cosimo de Medici centuries before, he preferred influence to display. He sought neither office nor title, yet presidents and kings sought his counsel. His office became a place where industrial magnates and politicians came to negotiate the fate of nations. He possessed a rare combination of authority and discretion, knowing when to intervene and when to remain silent. His word could make or break fortunes, but he valued reputation above publicity. In the world of finance, trust was capital, and Morgan's integrity became the cornerstone of his empire. His greatest achievement lay not in the wealth he accumulated, but in the systems he created. He helped establish corporate finance as a modern discipline, introduced professional management into industry, and set standards for transparency that later shaped financial regulation. Yet he was also a product of his time, a man who believed that responsibility should rest with the capable few. His worldview was hierarchical, echoing the paternalism of old aristocracies. He saw himself as guardian of national stability rather than servant of public opinion. When Morgan died in 1913, his funeral drew politicians, businessmen, and clergy from around the world. Newspapers estimated his fortune at far less than the public imagined, suggesting that his power had always been more institutional than personal. In truth, his legacy lived on not in numbers, but in influence. The Federal Reserve System, created shortly after his death, institutionalized the role he had played privately. The state absorbed the function of the individual, formalizing what he had demonstrated: that in the modern era, financial control could guide nations as surely as military command. From Cosimo de Medici's Florence to J.P. Morgan's New York, the evolution of unseen power reveals a recurring pattern. Wealth, when coupled with intelligence and discretion, can achieve what armies cannot, lasting control without open domination. Both men operated within systems that valued freedom and republican ideals, yet both bent those systems to their will by understanding the mechanisms of dependence. Money created ties more binding than feudal oaths, and credit became the new language of loyalty. Pope Urban II's legacy, though spiritual, shares the same logic. His call to arms was not an act of coercion, but of persuasion. Like the banker and the industrialist, he moved people through belief, whether faith in salvation, in stability, or in profit. The forms of power differed, but their essence was identical: the ability to align vast numbers of individuals behind an idea and sustain that alignment through trust. The story that began with kings and generals thus finds its continuation in priests, merchants, and financiers. Where once power was measured in land and armies, it came to reside in influence, organization, and conviction. The invisible architects of empire no longer needed crowns. Their empires were built of contracts, doctrines, and networks. Cosimo de Medici ruled a city without wearing a crown. Pope Urban II commanded armies without holding a sword, and J.P. Morgan governed economies without holding office. Each, in his own age, demonstrated that the battlefield of power lies not in open confrontation, but in the human mind, in the faith people place in institutions, ideas, and individuals. The Medici used art to sanctify authority, the papacy used faith to sanctify war, and Morgan used credit to sanctify capitalism. Their tools differed, yet all achieved what Bismarck, Cixi, and Richelieu had mastered in their own ways: the shaping of destiny through unseen means. History remembers kings and conquerors, yet it is often those who never wore crowns who defined the world's direction. The unseen rulers, whether in Florence's counting houses, Rome's cathedrals, or New York's boardrooms, prove that true sovereignty lies in influence, not ceremony. They remind us that empire can exist wherever one mind can direct the will of many, whether through belief, dependence, or debt. And so the story continues, from the banker who ruled a republic to the pope who moved nations to the financier who steadied a continent, each an uncrowned monarch in his own realm, each an architect of invisible power that endures long after thrones have crumbled. Power, in its purest form, has always been less about possession and more about persuasion. The men and women who ruled without crowns understood this truth better than most. From Richelieu's careful manipulation of France's monarchy to Cixi's control of China's imperial machinery, from Bismarck's unification of Germany through diplomacy to Cosimo de Medici's banking empire in Florence, and from Pope Urban II's spiritual mobilization to J.P. Morgan's financial dominance, all of them shared one essential understanding: influence was an art. What tied them together across centuries and continents was not lineage or title, but mastery over the mechanisms that made societies move. They commanded through institutions, alliances, and narratives. This form of control, subtle yet absolute, was the invisible skeleton of empires. To understand how uncrowned rulers maintained their dominance, one must first look at their alliances. No empire, visible or invisible, stands alone. Power, by nature, is relational. Even the most brilliant strategist requires partners, loyalists, and intermediaries. Richelieu knew this when he surrounded himself with a web of informants, diplomats, and administrators who extended his reach across France. He understood that alliances had to be built not only through favors, but through shared dependence. By offering opportunity, protection, or wealth, he ensured that those who served him saw their own fortunes tied to his success. Centuries later, Otto von Bismarck employed the same logic, though in a vastly different context. His genius lay in balancing rivals, rather than eliminating them. He aligned Prussia with or against powers like Austria and France as circumstances demanded, always ensuring that his state would emerge stronger. His famous system of alliances, after unification, was not merely a defensive network, but a masterpiece of equilibrium. He tied the great powers of Europe into a web so complex that none could move without him. Bismarck's strength lay not in the army, though it was formidable, but in his capacity to make others act in ways that served his design. His alliances were both political and psychological, a balance of fear, respect, and dependency. In Florence, Cosimo de Medici's alliances were woven not from treaties, but from accounts and promises. His bank extended credit to kings and popes, and in doing so, it bound them to him. The Medici learned early that debt could be as effective as loyalty. Their network of correspondents, merchants, and agents across Europe functioned like a private intelligence system. Each alliance was crafted with precision, designed to yield influence rather than simply profit. By supporting artists, architects, and scholars, Cosimo also built a cultural alliance that transcended politics. Those who depended on Medici patronage became silent ambassadors of his power. Even in the realm of faith, alliances determined the success of authority. Pope Urban II's call to the First Crusade was as much a diplomatic act as a spiritual one. He united kings, knights, and commoners under a single cause that transcended borders. His sermons and letters carefully appealed to every social class. Nobles were promised honor, peasants redemption, and merchants opportunity. In one stroke, Urban created an alliance of belief that transformed the fragmented politics of Europe. This unity, born of faith, gave the Church a political cohesion that kings often envied. Centuries later, J.P. Morgan would operate with a similar instinct, though his alliances were grounded in finance rather than faith. He cultivated partnerships with industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, with politicians, and with foreign investors. He built trust by reliability. When he backed a venture, it signaled stability. He understood that in the modern world, reputation was the new bond of loyalty. Morgan's alliances extended to the highest offices of government, yet they were never formal. They were alliances of necessity. Those in power needed his financial machinery to keep their economies running. If alliances formed the veins of influence, then institutions were its organs. Every uncrowned ruler understood that to endure, power must be embedded within the structures that govern daily life. Institutions, armies, treasuries, bureaucracies, banks, and churches were the true instruments of control. Richelieu saw this clearly. He restructured France's administration so that loyalty flowed to the crown, but authority passed through him. He created the system of intendants, royal officials who replaced the old nobility in provincial governance. These administrators answered to him directly, bypassing local power structures. Through them, he centralized authority while maintaining the illusion that the king ruled. Empress Dowager Cixi mastered a similar art in Qing, China. She controlled the imperial bureaucracy with precision, placing loyal eunuchs and ministers in key positions while ensuring that rivals were either isolated or indebted to her. Cixi understood that the appearance of continuity was vital. The emperor remained a symbol of divine order, but real power resided in her hands. She never wore the crown but controlled every lever of state, from the military garrisons guarding Beijing to the treasury that funded modernization. Her use of the bureaucracy was both defensive and offensive in preserving her authority, offensive in steering the empire through an age of upheaval. Otto von Bismarck, though operating in a different world, followed the same logic. As chancellor, he knew that control over institutions was the foundation of durable rule. He shaped the modern German state by integrating its fragmented parts into a unified bureaucracy. He placed loyal administrators in key ministries, ensured that the military answered to him more than to the monarch, and used the press to manage public opinion. His welfare policies, often seen as acts of compassion, were in truth acts of strategic control. By providing health insurance and pensions, he tied the working class to the state, weakening the appeal of socialism. His institutions were not merely administrative. They were psychological instruments designed to secure obedience through security. Cosimo de Medici's power, too, rested on institutions, though his were financial rather than political. The Medici Bank became the backbone of Florence's economy and, by extension, its politics. By managing the city's treasury and collecting taxes, Cosimo made himself indispensable. Even the papacy relied on Medici financial expertise to fund its operations. Through this institutional dominance, Cosimo turned private wealth into public authority. He did not need to command. He simply ensured that nothing important could function without his consent. J.P. Morgan's empire extended the principle of institutional control into the industrial age. He did not merely invest in companies, he reorganized them. He transformed disjointed railroads into coordinated systems, merged steel producers into unified corporations, and created financial structures that linked banks, industries, and governments. Morgan's real genius was in understanding that stability required institutional order. When crises struck, such as the Panic of 1907, he used his control over the banking network to restore confidence. By orchestrating loans, mergers, and bailouts, he demonstrated that institutions could obey a single will without any formal command. His library in New York became, for a time, the nerve center of American capitalism. The command of institutions, however, was only part of the equation. To rule invisibly, one had to shape perception. Influence could not survive without belief in legitimacy, in competence, or in destiny. Every uncrowned ruler mastered the art of self-presentation. They understood that the story others told about them was as important as the actions they took. Richelieu cultivated an image of solemn piety and unshakable purpose. His crimson robes and austere demeanor projected moral authority, while his writings justified his policies as acts of national salvation. He turned himself into the embodiment of France's stability. By appearing indispensable, he made resistance seem dangerous. Cixi, often misrepresented as a scheming despot by later historians, in her own time used imagery and ritual to assert her legitimacy. She commissioned portraits that depicted her as serene and motherly, surrounded by symbols of prosperity. She maintained the elaborate ceremonies of the Qing court, ensuring that every gesture reaffirmed the hierarchy she controlled. Even as she navigated modernity, introducing telegraphs, reforming education, and experimenting with industry, she preserved the aura of divine authority. To her subjects, she was both guardian of tradition and source of renewal. This dual image allowed her to survive in an age when dynasties elsewhere crumbled. Bismarck's mastery of propaganda was more direct. He understood the power of the press and used it ruthlessly. He manipulated news to provoke wars on his terms, as with the EMS dispatch, which inflamed French pride and led to the Franco-Prussian War. At home, he cultivated the image of the Iron Chancellor, a man of discipline and strength. Yet he also ensured that his public persona carried an air of paternal care. His speeches emphasized duty, order, and welfare. By controlling how he was perceived, Bismarck turned politics into theater, a stage where he wrote both script and performance. Cosimo de Medici's manipulation of perception was subtler. He avoided public office, yet ensured his name was spoken with reverence. He commissioned works of art that glorified Florence's greatness while quietly reminding citizens of his patronage. Brunelleschi's dome, Donatello's sculptures, and Fra Angelico's frescoes were as much instruments of propaganda as they were masterpieces. They symbolized divine favor upon the city and, by extension, upon the Medici family. Cosimo's power appeared benevolent because it was wrapped in beauty. He made influence feel like generosity, control like civic virtue. J.P. Morgan, though operating in a democratic republic, mastered the same balance. He cultivated an image of stoic integrity. Photographs of his stern face and piercing eyes became symbols of authority. The press, often critical of his power, nonetheless respected his reliability. When financial panic struck, the public looked to Morgan as the man who could restore order. His dominance was justified by competence, his authority by necessity. Like the old cardinals and chancellors of Europe, he ruled because others believed no one else could. The manipulation of perception extended beyond individuals to the shaping of national narratives. Richelieu framed his consolidation of power as the defense of France against chaos. Cixi presented modernization as preservation of imperial harmony. Bismarck justified authoritarian policies as safeguards of unity. Cosimo linked Florence's prosperity to Medici stewardship. Morgan cast consolidation as patriotic duty. Each converted self-interest into public virtue, masking ambition beneath the language of service. Underlying all these examples was a deeper truth about the mechanics of influence. It relied on understanding human nature. The uncrowned rulers recognized that people craved stability, meaning, and belonging. They offered these in exchange for obedience. They built alliances by satisfying ambition, controlled institutions by rewarding loyalty, and shaped perception by appealing to emotion. Their power was not imposed but invited. It endured because it made itself seem natural, inevitable, even moral. This invisible architecture of influence endured through time because it adapted to changing circumstances. In the age of monarchs, it took the form of councils and courts. In the age of empires, it appeared as ministries and colonial offices. In the industrial era, it manifested in banks, corporations, and media. Yet the principles remained constant. The invisible ruler must see farther than others, act through others, and convince others that his rule serves a greater purpose. The pattern extended beyond individuals to entire systems. The British Empire, for instance, was governed as much by merchants, administrators, and financiers as by monarchs. The East India Company wielded authority across continents long before the crown took formal control. Its directors and agents operated with the same logic as Richelieu or Cosimo: alliances through trade, institutions through bureaucracy, legitimacy through rhetoric of civilization. The company's boardrooms in London were as decisive for empire as any battlefield in Asia. Similarly, the modern age of multinational corporations and global institutions follows the same mechanics. Central banks, investment firms, and international organizations wield influence comparable to that once held by chancellors or popes. Their leaders, like J.P. Morgan in his time, operate behind the scenes, shaping economies through policy, loans, and regulations. The forms have changed, but the essence remains: control through systems, persuasion through trust. The mechanics of influence reveal a paradox. True power often hides behind humility. Those who rule indirectly must appear to serve. They must let others believe they are in command while quietly setting the course. Richelieu's king signed decrees he barely understood. Cixi's emperors issued edicts she dictated. Bismarck's monarch bestowed honors for decisions already made. Cosimo's city councils passed measures he financed. Morgan's presidents announced recoveries he engineered. In each case, the visible ruler was the mask through which the invisible one spoke. In studying these figures, we uncover a deeper continuity in history. That civilization has always depended on those who manage its invisible machinery. Wars decide moments, but institutions decide eras. Charisma can win battles, but alliances preserve peace. Propaganda can mislead, but belief sustains authority. The true architects of empire, whether cardinals, bankers, or chancellors, have always known this. They ruled not by force, but by understanding how force itself could be directed through systems of loyalty, fear, and faith. Their legacies endure because they built frameworks stronger than personalities. Richelieu's centralization made France a world power long after his death. Cixi's reforms, though incomplete, preserved China's sovereignty during one of its most perilous centuries. Bismarck's institutions survived 2 world wars. The Medici's patronage seeded the Renaissance. Morgan's financial systems became the backbone of modern capitalism. Each mastered the mechanics of influence so completely that their power outlived them. In the end, the uncrowned rulers achieved what many crowned heads never could: permanence. Their empires were not territories but structures of thought and organization. Their thrones were invisible because they existed in the minds of those who believed in their necessity. The mechanics of influence, alliances, institutions, and perception formed the true triad of lasting power. From the palaces of Florence to the boardrooms of New York, from the cathedrals of Rome to the ministries of Berlin, the lesson remains the same. Control the networks that bind people, and you control history itself. The story that began with whispers in royal courts and concluded with the hum of modern economies continues even now. The faces have changed, the titles have vanished, but the methods remain. Influence, once learned, does not die. It merely finds new forms, new institutions, new audiences. The invisible architects of empire still walk among us, not in armor or robes, but in suits and offices, speaking softly yet steering the world with the same unseen precision that defined their predecessors. The story of power has never been only about thrones, crowns, or armies marching in the sun. It has always been about influence, the quiet kind that moves unseen through councils, markets, and minds. From Richelieu's intricate control of France to the Medici shaping Florence through finance and art, from Empress Dowager Cixi ruling from behind a curtain in the Forbidden City to Otto von Bismarck uniting Germany through diplomacy rather than conquest, from Pope Urban II wielding faith as a weapon to J.P. Morgan directing nations through credit and industry, each of these figures revealed something fundamental about how authority functions. Their power was enduring not because it shouted, but because it whispered effectively. What they built and the methods they used have never truly disappeared. The echoes of these uncrowned kings still shape the modern world, defining how nations govern, how economies move, and how influence travels silently through every level of society. Their impact on history is impossible to overstate. Cardinal Richelieu's centralization of France laid the foundation for the age of absolutism that would follow under Louis XIV. By stripping the nobility of independent military and political power, he created a model of administration that became the blueprint for modern nation-states. The France he shaped through bureaucracy and reason became a force that dominated Europe for centuries. His insistence on the supremacy of the state over individual ambition and his belief in a rational, centralized authority echoed far beyond his lifetime. The very idea of statecraft, governance as an art distinct from personal rule, took form through him. Empress Dowager Cixi's reign over the Qing dynasty, though shadowed by controversy, left a similar legacy in Asia. She preserved China through one of the most turbulent centuries in its history, navigating both internal rebellions and foreign incursions. By maintaining imperial continuity, even as the world around her modernized and industrialized, she kept China intact when neighboring empires crumbled. Her cautious approach to reform, balancing tradition with modernization, delayed the fall of the dynasty long enough for the idea of Chinese unity to survive into the modern era. Her rule demonstrated that even within rigid systems, flexibility and political acumen could hold empires together. Otto von Bismarck's mastery of diplomacy altered the entire structure of Europe. His unification of Germany under Prussian leadership changed the balance of power that had existed for centuries. By using wars as precise instruments rather than acts of destruction, he reshaped the political geography of the continent. More than his victories, it was his system of alliances and his careful maintenance of peace that defined his legacy. He managed Europe like a chessboard, ensuring that every piece moved according to his design. The political order he created endured long after his dismissal and influenced the structure of modern diplomacy itself. Even today, the principles of balance, alliance, and deterrence that he practiced remain essential to international relations. Cosimo de Medici's quiet dominance of Florence reshaped the world through culture as much as through politics. The patronage system he built made art and learning instruments of prestige and stability. By financing artists, architects, and scholars, he turned cultural achievement into a form of governance. The Renaissance that flourished under his guidance transformed Europe's imagination, altering how people saw knowledge, beauty, and human potential. Through him, the idea emerged that soft power, the ability to inspire and elevate, could be stronger than military force. His descendants continued his legacy, spreading Medici influence into royal courts and even the Vatican, where two Medici popes extended the family's reach beyond Italy. Pope Urban II's influence reverberated across centuries. His call to the First Crusade changed not only the religious landscape, but also the political and economic structure of medieval Europe. The Crusades opened trade routes, reshaped social hierarchies, and fostered an awareness of a broader world beyond Europe's borders. They also solidified the papacy's role as a central political power capable of mobilizing entire populations. Urban's speech at Clermont marked the moment when faith became a global instrument of coordination, binding kingdoms under one banner. His actions turned spiritual authority into a force that could move armies and redraw borders. Proof that the pen, when wielded with conviction, could summon swords. J.P. Morgan's role in the evolution of modern finance transformed not only the American economy, but the global one. He institutionalized corporate capitalism, linking governments, industries, and markets in ways that define the modern world. The systems he designed to manage crises and stabilize economies became the foundation for the Federal Reserve and later international banking structures. His interventions during financial panics proved that private authority could act more swiftly and effectively than public institutions. Though his methods were controversial, his understanding of stability and trust as economic necessities became a lasting principle of financial governance. The industrial world that emerged under his influence still follows the same rhythm. Power lies in those who can control flow of money, information, and confidence. Taken together, these figures reshaped civilization. They demonstrated that the real architects of history often work behind the scenes. Their impact can be traced not only in monuments or borders, but in systems and habits that persist across time. The modern state owes its structure to Richelieu and Bismarck. The modern economy reflects the legacy of the Medici and Morgan. The relationship between belief and politics, shaped by Urban II, continues to define global conflict and unity. Even the cultural diplomacy that now forms part of international relations finds its roots in the artistic patronage of Florence. And the balancing act between tradition and reform that guides many societies today echoes the cautious wisdom of Cixi's rule. Their stories also reveal that power, to endure, must adapt. None of these figures could have ruled through open tyranny alone. Each found ways to align personal ambition with public necessity. Richelieu justified his centralization as service to France. Cixi presented her dominance as guardianship of imperial continuity. Bismarck described his policies as defenses of peace. Cosimo claimed to act only for Florence's prosperity. Morgan declared his interventions to be patriotic duty. Even Urban II framed his call to arms as moral salvation. In every case, legitimacy was essential. They understood that influence survives only when it wears the mask of purpose. For the modern world, their lessons remain urgent. Today, as politics and economics grow ever more complex, power again operates in the shadows. Behind the visible leaders stand advisors, financiers, strategists, and bureaucrats who, like the uncrowned rulers of old, guide decisions without bearing the weight of formal authority. Understanding their methods helps us see how influence functions in our own age. The first lesson is that power is never only what it appears to be. It often resides in those who shape the options rather than those who make the choices. In medieval Europe, it was the cardinal who wrote the king's policy. In imperial China, it was the dowager who decided the emperor's decrees. In modern finance, it was the banker who dictated the government's rescue plan. The visible face of authority often conceals the mind directing it. This principle has not changed. Today's governments, corporations, and institutions are filled with unseen hands that manage policy, economics, and public opinion from behind the scenes. The second lesson is that power depends on systems, not individuals. Each of these figures built structures that outlived them. Richelieu's administrative reforms, Bismarck's welfare institutions, and Morgan's financial networks became self-sustaining. Even when their founders died or were dismissed, the systems continued to function according to the logic they had designed. This is the essence of enduring power. It survives personal mortality by embedding itself into the routines and assumptions of society. Modern bureaucracies, multinational corporations, and global organizations all operate on this same foundation. The third lesson concerns perception. Influence thrives on belief, and belief can be manufactured. Richelieu's image of piety, Bismarck's projection of strength, Cixi's maternal symbolism, and Morgan's aura of reliability all demonstrate that legitimacy is often a matter of presentation. Public confidence, once secured, allows authority to act without resistance. This remains true in the digital age, where narratives spread faster than facts and perception can outweigh policy. Those who control stories through media, technology, or culture continue the same work that the Medici began with art and that Richelieu perfected with rhetoric. The fourth lesson is the moral ambiguity of influence. The uncrowned kings were neither purely benevolent nor wholly tyrannical. Their actions brought progress and suffering in equal measure. Richelieu strengthened France, but crushed its nobility. Cixi preserved stability, but delayed modernization. Bismarck unified Germany, but sowed the seeds of later conflict. Urban's crusades united Christendom, but unleashed centuries of violence. Morgan stabilized the economy, but deepened the divide between wealth and labor. Cosimo's patronage fostered creativity, but also entrenched oligarchy. Their legacies remind us that power, when hidden, escapes accountability. The same mechanisms that achieve stability can suppress freedom. Yet their stories also show that influence, when guided by foresight and restraint, can achieve what force cannot. They prove that leadership is not always loud, that persuasion can be more lasting than domination, and that understanding the mechanics of human behavior is the surest way to shape history. The best of them governed by aligning interests rather than imposing will. Their genius lay in seeing how the invisible threads of society, loyalty, faith, fear, and ambition, could be woven into enduring order. In studying them, we learn to look differently at our own world. Modern power is decentralized, global, and technological, yet it still follows the same ancient patterns. Alliances of nations mirror the alliances of Renaissance states. Central banks function as the treasuries of empire once did. Corporations, like royal houses, wield influence through wealth and patronage. Social media and mass communication now perform the role that art and sermons once did, shaping collective belief. The faces and tools have changed, but the strategy endures. When we watch political debates, economic crises, or international negotiations, we see only the surface. Beneath it operates the same machinery that Richelieu, Cosimo, Cixi, Bismarck, Urban, and Morgan once mastered. The negotiations behind closed doors, the quiet shaping of policies, the calculated release of information. All are modern forms of invisible rule. The uncrowned kings have not vanished, they have multiplied. Their enduring legacy lies not only in their historical achievements, but in the very concept of governance they pioneered. They showed that authority does not require ownership, that command does not require visibility, and that permanence is achieved not through dominance, but through design. By embedding their will into systems, be they religious, political, financial, or cultural, they created power that could survive succession, rebellion, and even revolution. The echoes of their methods reach into every modern institution. The diplomat who balances rival nations follows Bismarck's logic. The central banker who calms markets channels Morgan's composure. The political strategist who manages a leader's image applies Richelieu's craft. The philanthropist who uses art or education to shape opinion mirrors Cosimo's patronage. Even the leaders who combine tradition with innovation reflect Cixi's delicate equilibrium. Their legacies are not relics of the past, but templates for the present. But there is a deeper lesson still. The stories of these figures challenge our understanding of leadership itself. They remind us that greatness is not measured only by visibility. Many of the most decisive figures in history never wore crowns, never commanded armies in person, and never sought public glory. They ruled because they understood that real power lies in knowing what others desire, fear, or believe, and in using that knowledge to steer events. They also remind us that every age produces its own form of invisible power. The tools evolve, but the essence remains the same. Where the Medici used banking, modern leaders use data. Where Richelieu controlled correspondence and spies, today's influencers manage digital networks. Where Urban II rallied men through sermons, modern movements spread through screens. The stage changes, but the performance endures. In reflecting on their stories, we are forced to question how power functions in our own time. Do we truly know who governs us, who decides the fate of economies, or directs the course of wars? Are the visible leaders the true decision-makers, or do they merely echo the will of unseen architects? The lessons of history suggest that the latter is often the case. The uncrowned kings of the past remind us to look beyond the spectacle, beyond the speeches and titles, and to seek the structures that sustain authority. Their impact on nations and continents was immense, but their greater gift was the insight they left behind. That control lies not in possession but in influence, not in visibility but in continuity. The systems they built, bureaucratic, economic, cultural, continue to define how societies function. They taught the world that empire could exist without conquest, that belief could govern as effectively as law, and that organization could outlast charisma. As history turns its pages, the figures of Richelieu, Cixi, Bismarck, Cosimo, Urban, and Morgan remain as reminders of the unseen foundations upon which civilizations rest. Their methods shaped not only their own eras, but the very way we understand governance and power. They demonstrated that to endure, authority must adapt, disguise itself, and root its logic deep within the fabric of everyday life. The stories of these uncrowned rulers invite us to look deeper, to question appearances, and to recognize that influence often hides where we least expect it. Power, in all ages, is both visible and invisible, both personal and structural. The crowns that glitter in public are often less significant than the hands that built them. The lessons of these masters of unseen rule are clear. To understand history, one must look not only at who held the throne, but at who made it matter. Their echoes will never fade because their principles are timeless. Influence, alliances, institutions, and perception, these are the true instruments of rule. Every era merely tunes them to its own rhythm. The uncrowned kings of history have shown that leadership is not a spectacle but a strategy, not a title but a talent, not a position but a possession of understanding. They are the architects whose designs outlasted empires, whose legacies became the scaffolding of modern power. To study them is to uncover the real anatomy of authority. It is to realize that the fate of nations often rests not on those who claim to lead, but on those who quietly ensure that leadership endures. Their lives stand as both warning and wisdom. That power, once achieved through influence, becomes nearly impossible to uproot. It adapts, it hides, it reincarnates. And in every generation, somewhere behind the curtain, another uncrowned ruler waits, steering the world once again.